Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Friday. Anyone got anything fun planned for the weekend?
Sleep.
You're gonna sleep? That's what you say every weekend. But I get that. I'm gonna sleep a little bit too. What else? Fun stuff?
Gym,
Kim-
going to the gym.
Yukimi says no. Anna's going to the gym. Is that fun?
Yeah, I
Oh.
love it.
Yeah? Okay. Going to the gym. What else? Anything else? Sleep, gym, eat. Repeat. That's what I do too, except without the gym part. I gotta get back. I gotta get back to the gym. Okay. Let's see. So yesterday, I should say hi to some people here. Sabrina's here. Good morning, Sabrina. And Sala's here. Hello, Sala. Mike's here. Good morning, Mike. Clara's here. Good morning, Clara. Gabrielle's here. Hello, Gabrielle. Zion's here. Good morning, Zion. Chan is here. Good morning to you. And Daniel's here. Good morning. Good evening, Daniel. And John is here. Good morning to you, sir. Okay. So yesterday we were talking about racism, of course, because that's the unit that we're in. And we were talking about a little bit about racism, and we were about to get into systemic racism in the United States, right? And we said that even though, of course, race doesn't really have any sort of biological foundation or biological legitimacy, it does have real consequences, right? Anything that people give meaning to can be very powerful, right? And there doesn't have to be anything real about it, right? And so you could say, yeah, no, I won't say that. Yeah, anything that people give meaning to has powerful consequences for society. And so, again, this kind of ideology of race is created in the sort of colonial period when white Europeans are sailing around the globe, taking over other people's lands, and kind of trying to find a way to legitimize their poor treatment of these people. And what they managed to come up with is that, oh, well, it's okay to treat these people poorly and take their land and their stuff because they're not as good as us, right? They are not as intelligent, not as civilized, not as human, but maybe we can teach them, right, Gordon? Maybe we can teach them to
Teach what?
social construction of race, kind of the white man's burden kind of idea.
White guilt?
If you will. No, white guilt comes later.
Oh,
The burden comes first, and then the guilt comes later.
Okay.
Yeah. We're in the guilt phase now, but in class we're in the burden part. So the race is constructed as an ideology in order to legitimize the poor treatment of people around the world, right? And so you can see these kind of ideologies appear, and then science begins to back them up, and we're putting science in quotes because it's pretty poor science, as we've already seen. Phrenology, craniometry, flimsy stuff.
And then you get really bad studies that try to justify poor treatment of individuals.
There's bad science out there.
Very bad science.
Yeah.
And, election, you can see it right now in terms of just all the issues that are coming up in terms of the American election, in terms of race. This is coming to the forefront, right?
In a bit, I actually feel like I feel like racism in the United States was having a bit of a moment, maybe 6 months ago or so. But I feel like the election has kind of pushed out, all of the, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter, all of that stuff has kind of been like pushed aside so that the election can absorb all of the media attention.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that I saw someone put out with this headline, and I think it's true to some extent, where we had 8 years of Obama, and you could argue that Obama's reign was very progressive. He did a lot for minorities, and now we see 4 years of Trump, and how can we rationalize such a drastic change between tolerance and open racism in one sense?
You know, I think it. What did the author say?
Well, I think what they said was it's not that America just suddenly became racist. It is because there is someone who has very high power and very high influence who's almost made it okay to say certain things. And that's kind of how we construct certain things, where in one period of time, maybe it's okay to do certain things. For example, 10, 15, 20 years ago, hi Sam, nice that you join us. 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was okay to say, things like, for example, that's so gay, or it's not okay to be gay. Now, it's absolutely not okay to do those things, right? So as cultures and societies evolve, I think we change certain things about how we view things, for good and bad.
That's true.
Go on a bit of
Sort of borrowed him for a few minutes, but where the heck were we?
Racism.
Right. So, yeah. So racism is legitimized. It is a tool to legitimize the poor treatment of non-white peoples, right? And again, science quotes starts to back that up. Of course, religion is used to back that up, and as a result, you see these things starting to find their way into the legal structures of the United States, right? And so this is very early on, right? So the Declaration of Independence that the Americans signed, I think that's 1774, right? So even just a decade or so later, these sort of markers of race are starting to find their way into legal documents, right? So you can see here, people are asked to claim their race as of 1790. In 1825, the government is determining who is and is not an indigenous person. And as this kind of continues on, there are more and more people who are invested in being white because whiteness confers you certain political and economic and legal advantages, right? So people are actually trying to portray themselves as white or get the court to see them as white. But we also said that white is more than about skin color, right? White is a social construction. And so in the history of the United States, whether or not someone was white had to do with, at different times, again, Mexican immigrants were considered white, but then not. Jewish and Irish and Italian immigrants were sometimes considered white, but then sometimes not. And some states actually had what they called a one-drop rule. And so, and this was a pretty racist rule, but if you had even one drop of blood from a black ancestor, so if you had even one black ancestor, even if they were, a couple of generations back, and even if you appeared totally white to everyone around you, you still could not be classified as white if you had even one black ancestor. So again, white is, it's a skin color, I guess, but for the United States here in their early history, it's kind of a political, legal status, right? That is connected to ancestry and connected to skin color, but also a way of maintaining power as well, right? So I cut out a bunch of slides here, and basically what these slides are saying, did I cut these out? Right, because I wanted to get to this, and what those slides basically say is that the U.S. has a long history of racism, right? Blacks were brought to America in order to, as slaves, right, as property. And then as of 1865, they were freed, right, by the Emancipation Proclamation. That's Abraham Lincoln's thing, where he frees the slaves. But of course, in states where slavery had existed, it doesn't mean that racism and prejudice and discrimination are over, right? And so again, these states start passing laws and creating structures to make sure that black people remain at the bottom of society. Are you familiar with the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan? Have you ever heard of them? Yeah? So the KKK, maybe we'll, I think I have a reading on that involves them a little bit later, so we'll get a little more background on them. But they're a white supremacist organization. You might see them in movies, and they wear all white, and they have kind of like that white hood with the point, and you can just see their eyes or something. They appear at this time as well. So as soon as black Americans are freed, as soon as slavery is abolished, these guys appear to make sure that black people stay in their place, right? Stay kind of at the bottom of society. And so, again, we have a long history of kind of racism and fighting, and black Americans fighting for equality in the United States. And so that goes all the way through the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, when there's a civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so Martin Luther King, you heard of Martin Luther King? Yeah. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and others, Rosa Parks, all of these people are kind of actively fighting for equality and for civil rights. Around this time, schools are desegregated. So prior to about 1962, schools in many US states are segregated. So you go to a black school or a white school. And so eventually that's ruled to be unconstitutional. There's a court case that it's Brown versus the Board of Education is the landmark case in which they prove that having two separate school systems for blacks and whites is unconstitutional and unequal. And so the schools have to be integrated. Black students can go to white schools and vice versa, or I guess more appropriately, there are no such thing as black or white schools, there's just schools. Everybody can go to them. But even that takes a little while for people to get used to. And so finally we get to, 2020, when we're still not at a place of equality, right? Even after slavery is abolished and, we've got decades of education and fighting for civil rights. We've got Martin Luther King. We've got all of this stuff happening, and still we seem to have an issue in the United States and in Canada as well, but we'll get to Canada. We have an issue in the United States with racism, and particularly with systemic racism. Now, remind me yesterday, how far did we get into this article?
We haven't even answered one question.
Did we start reading it?
We read it, but we didn't.
We read it, but we didn't talk about it. Oh yeah, because I said what we would do at the beginning of today's class was to look at the argument. Right. Okay, it's all coming back now. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that article. So what is the author's argument? I'm just going to pull it up on my screen here so I can refer to it. Here's a worksheet. America's long overdue awakening to systemic racism. So this is written by Justin Warland, and as you can see here, it's a very recent article, right? So it comes out in June of this year, so just a few months old. What argument is Justin making?
I think that what you want trying to say is that racism still exists in America.
Okay, so that's the conclusion?
Yeah.
Okay, conclusion, racism still exists in America. How do we feel about that as a conclusion to this argument?
Specifically systemic racism.
Say again?
Systemic racism.
You want to add systemic racism to, okay. So America continues to have a problem with systemic racism. How do you feel about that for a conclusion? Pretty good? Anna, you feel good about that? Yeah? Did you have something different?
No, I just wanted to add, and people are not really aware of
And,
that.
and people are not aware?
Yeah. Most people are aware of that.
Okay, let me just think of, I guess it depends on how you,
Like, for example, in the context, it says 57% of Americans only know about racism.
okay. Okay, so let's modify it. Can we modify it to Americans continue to be unaware of systemic racism in their country or in the United States?
Wow.
Wow?
Yeah.
Does that sound good?
You're so good at putting everything.
Well, that's my job, is I'm supposed to glue things together and hopefully it adds up to something. Okay, so Americans continue to be unaware or uneducated or confused about the existence of systemic racism in their country. So again, as good critical thinkers, why should we believe that? What's one premise?
The death of George Floyd, I think the author mentioned.
The author does mention George Floyd, right, who was killed by police officers in May of this year. Was it April or May of this year?
Around May.
Yeah, around May. So around May of this year, right? But okay, so let me just see. I just need a minute to scan through this article and remind myself what's here. Okay. So Americans continue to be unaware of systemic racism in their country. What's one premise?
Black people are more likely to suffer from police brutality.
Okay, I wouldn't say that's a premise, but I would say it's a piece of evidence that might support a premise, right? So, because there's kind of a statistic, right? That Black Americans continue to suffer higher levels of police brutality than white Americans. Perfect support for a premise, but we need a premise that will encompass that and maybe some other evidence or details as well.
They don't get the same, how can I say, the same things as the other Americans get in case of health and healthcare.
Okay, so there's a lot of statistics that show that that Black Americans are disadvantaged, right? That they don't get the same health care, they don't get the same education, they are disproportionately in trouble with the police. I forget some of the other stats that they give us. Dying in childbirth as well is in there, isn't it? And coronavirus, right? So Black women are more likely to die in childbirth. Black communities are suffering more deaths from coronavirus than white communities. So there's a lot of societal data, right? Society-wide data that's suggesting that the outcomes for Black Americans is significantly worse than that for white Americans, right? And so think about the sample size there, right? Those statistics are based on a lot of data, right? A huge collection of data. They didn't ask 7 people what their experience was. Those are large statistics that the government is actually keeping track of, right? I don't know if they have a Bureau of Statistics or whatever in the US. Here in Canada, we have Statistics Canada, and Statistics Canada keeps track of all kinds of stuff for the Canadian government. And so, yeah, those stats are big, right? They're big numbers, big data, and they show us broad patterns. Okay, maybe that's one premise, right? That Black Americans continue to be disadvantaged in a number of societal-wide instances, right? And then all of those little pieces of data are evidence that support that premise. What's another premise, maybe?
I'm not sure, but maybe the protesters who were protesting peacefully in front of the White House, faced the cruelty of the police.
Right. So the author at the beginning tells that story. Are you aware of that story? Of what happened? So when they talk about Lafayette Park at the beginning of this article, did you hear that news story? This is from about June. It's probably early June when this happens. No? So people who are protesting, I think in support of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and all that, they're kind of protesting outside of the White House. And I think that in the course of the night, a church had been damaged, a church near to the White House. And so Donald Trump, for some reason, which I can't entirely explain, decides he wants to go and take a photo in front of this church. So he goes out there. He's got riot police in front of him that kind of fire tear gas and things at people to clear the protesters away so that he can walk to this church and have his picture taken with a Bible.
Why?
I can't answer that. I can't answer. I don't know what his rationale is there, but that happened, right? And so the author here is connecting kind of that story with, well, I don't know, what's the point of that story to the author? Just going to go back to it here.
Is Donald Trump Christian? Why do you hold up Bibles?
It doesn't say why, and I'm not sure why he did it. But why he did it maybe doesn't matter so much as the fact that he did. Okay. I'm not sure that has to do with any premises of the. I think it's contextual is what it is, right? So the author's making an argument here, but there's some context around that argument too, right? And so there's some narrative elements that are around the argument that sort of give you a bit of a story. So I don't think that's part of the argument, but I think it just provides context for what's going on. What's maybe another premise for this argument? Black Americans do not have equal access to opportunities. Yeah, I think we could probably use that as a premise. Is there evidence in here that supports that?
Oh yeah, right.
Equal opportunity, like unemployment, the school system.
Right.
That are under-resourced in Black Americans.
Okay. So some of the statistics that the author provides could be divided up into two pieces, right? There could be, we're seeing Black Americans have less access to opportunities, to education, to employment. And on the other side of that, we're seeing that their outcomes are worse, right? In terms of their educational outcomes and health and so forth, right? So it could be, one premise could be fewer opportunities or lesser opportunities. The other premise could be the outcomes are systematically worse for Black Americans, right? Yeah, I like that. What else? Is there another premise in here? Gabrielle's mentioning here that COVID affects African Americans disproportionately, which is definitely true. And so we would probably put that in the outcomes or the effects premise, right? What else? Sorry?
Back on the previous laws, like previous discriminatory laws, still have effects today.
Right. So we have laws that were created in the past that discriminate against Black Americans or just people of color in the U.S. And those laws remain functional, right? Does he give an example of any of those?
What I mean is like they used to be very, very racist and discriminatory, and then they abolished slavery, but the effects of what they did that time are still present.
Right. And so maybe we can, yeah. So there is a legacy of discrimination, prejudice, racism, slavery in this country, right? This country was founded on slavery, right? And there's a legacy of that just doesn't go away. And if it does go away, it doesn't go away easily or without work, right? And so, yeah, there's a legacy of slavery that is still in play, right? That is still influencing how American society works. Yeah, I like that one. So we've got so far we got an argument that says Americans continue to be unaware of systemic racism in their country. Why should we believe that? Well, first of all, you have a legacy of slavery in your country and prejudice. You have a history of that to begin with, and that hasn't really gone away. You have statistics that show you that Black Americans systematically have fewer access or worse access to education and to employment. If we look at various outcomes in terms of health and education, we see that again, Black Americans their outcomes are worse in these instances. Anything else? There might be one more.
I think that's the one when Black people serve more time in prison than white people do.
Right. And I would, yeah, I would put that piece of evidence, I think, under the negative outcomes. I think so. But I think there might be one more piece. And it might have to do with the continuing to be unaware thing.
Oh, is it that's the evidence? I don't know the premise. Is it when he went to like Auschwitz, you can very clearly tell that something happened there, but they sweep whatever happened under the rug, so Americans are blind to what happened.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. Yeah. So the author says he was recently in Berlin, right? And Berlin, for those of you who know, was the center of Germany during Nazi Germany. All of, this is where Hitler ruled Germany from. This is where, all kinds of bad things were put into practice, like the Holocaust and concentration camps and all kinds of things. And the author says, you can't go anywhere without being reminded of that, right? There are Holocaust memorials, there are signs, there are plaques. We saw, in my history class, I show a video that talks about the legacy of Nazi Germany. And there's, outside of the train station, the main train station in Berlin, where everybody gets on to take the train to work, they still have the destination cards for the concentration camps out front. So it says all the different train stops that you might get off to go to your place of work or school, but also Auschwitz is still there, and Dachau, and all of these places, because people actually 90 years ago were sent from that train station to death camps. They left from that station, the station that people are leaving to go to work from today. And so, yeah, you can clearly see the evidence of their kind of dark past memorialized everywhere in Berlin. But the author's saying here, you don't see any of that, right? We don't have any, the US doesn't really have any monuments to slavery or to the people who were brought here and died or worked to death, right? There's none of that. Instead, what you often have are monuments to Confederate generals. And this wound up in the news a little while ago as well, right? So we have monuments to people like General Lee and General Jackson. These guys were Confederate generals who were fighting the Civil War in order to make sure that they still could keep slaves. But those are the guys that have monuments in the park. There's no monuments to the people who suffered and died under that institution of slavery. And so, yeah, maybe it's no surprise that Americans are unaware of systemic racism, because their public monuments and their public spaces suggest that they're not really paying attention to it, right? Particularly in the South, where they seem to have paid attention to their war generals, their war heroes, but forgetting about the fact that they were fighting so that they could continue to keep slaves. That was one of their aims in fighting this Civil War. So, yeah, maybe that's evidence not only that Americans aren't remembering it, but maybe that they don't want to remember, right? They don't want to pay attention to that. the people in Berlin, the Germans, want to pay attention to that, and so they have monuments everywhere. But it seems like the Americans aren't, maybe they would just rather move on, right, and just get on with America, right? But again, these things don't go away, and they haven't gone away, right? Slavery was abolished 150, 160 years ago, but still dealing with it to the point where there are massive demonstrations in the streets in the US to this day, right? So clearly, I think more needs to be done, right? Because it's, again, this hasn't gone away. What do you think of that as an argument? Do you think that works? Americans continue to be unaware of systemic racism in their country. There is a legacy of racism based on the practice of slavery hundreds of years ago. The data show us that Black Americans have fewer opportunities than white Americans. As a result, their educational and health and other types of outcomes are less than white Americans. And again, maybe we shouldn't be surprised because the Americans don't seem like they want to deal with it. They seem like they don't want to engage with this sort of problematic history, right? In a way that the Germans are, right? The Germans they have a really dark history, right? The Germans have an uncomfortable few chapters of their history to deal with, and they're acknowledging it, right? They're remembering that it happened, even though I'm sure that they would rather not, right? But maybe the Americans aren't doing that. And here, I'm just sort of scrolling through. Yeah, and I think this kind of drives it home too. The author says, this is on the first page, the end of the first page. He says, since then, the debate over systemic racism has spread across the nation and around the world. Trump's administration, so this is from the White House, the highest government power in the United States, the White House has repeatedly denied that discrimination against Black Americans is embedded in the political, economic, and social structure of the country. So not only are Americans not interested in engaging with this or ending this in a proper way, but I mean the highest government is saying, no, that's not a thing, right? They're saying the systemic racism, it's not a thing, doesn't happen. So again, how can Americans become aware and how can they engage with their past when their highest leaders are saying, oh no, you've got us wrong, that's not us at all, right? Yeah. Anything else you want to say about this article? Anything else that jumped out at you or confused you or? No? Yes? No?
So can we say that when he says like the 57% of people are aware, so can we put it as a premises? I think where that would go, like if I was trying to figure out, I think we've identified the author's argument. And so I think that piece of information is almost maybe an indication that things are changing. And so if you were writing this, like if this was your argument in a paper, that's probably something I would add in the conclusion. And I would say, that Americans continue to be unaware of systemic racism. There's a legacy of racism. The opportunities for Black Americans are less. The outcomes are less. And their public spaces do not seem to acknowledge that any of this happened. However, some of the polls seem to suggest that those attitudes are changing, that people are becoming more aware of what systemic racism is, how it works, and the fact that it is actually a real thing, right? So I think that's probably where I would put it is, it's the light at the end of the tunnel, right? This is my argument. Americans are not aware and have not been aware of this thing. However, but that attitude may be changing.
And people may be starting to kind of see the light a little bit. We may be able to move forward, maybe. Yeah. Okay, last comments on this? Anyone else want to say anything? Say anything else? No? Okay. Let's see what's next. Oh, right. Now Canada, because I don't want to, we've been talking a lot about the United States, and we talked about it especially because race continues to be a clear and present issue in the United States. But I don't want to suggest that the United States is the only country that experiences racism, and especially here in Canada, that we don't have it, because we absolutely certainly do. And race in Canada has been constructed in a similar way and for similar purposes. And so what I'd like to talk to you about is a little bit about the social construction of race in Canada and sort of the process of Canada becoming a country. So there's a little bit of Canadian history here, there's a little bit of social justice here, and I'll kind of explain how this process unfolds. But I think before I get into it, maybe we'll take a break first so that I can just sort of get into the whole story and uninterrupted. Okay, so let's take a break, come back in 10, and I'll tell you about Canada. All right, and we are officially back. So, like I told you, I didn't want to give you the impression that Canada does not have its own issues with racism and that Canada has not socially constructed race in a similar way, because the truth is it absolutely has. Again, today what we've become is kind of a country that I guess prides itself, or what's the word I'm looking to, how am I trying to say this?
Different from America?
We definitely position ourselves as different from Americans. We like to define ourselves based on what we're not. We're not those guys over there, right? But we also like to define ourselves as a multicultural country, right? A country that's accepting of all kinds of people. And I think to many degrees that is true. I don't think it's perfectly true, but it is, I think, in some ways generally true. We have some ways to go, but we'll get to that later. But in terms of how Canada was created, it wasn't originally created to be a multicultural country. Really what it was meant to be at the beginning was a white Christian country. That's what it was supposed to be, quote unquote. And only later did we sort of arrive at a place of multiculturalism, but we'll get to that. Oh, wow. The first thing I guess I should show you, I forgot that I put this in here, is the reason we call First Nations people or First People is because they're actually the first humans here. And so anthropologically speaking, this is kind of a map of human migration. And so our earliest ancestors of our species, of Homo sapiens, probably evolve in Africa maybe around 300,000 years ago, maybe 350. The evidence is still coming in, and there's not a lot of it, and so it's very difficult to piece together that history, but our species seems to be about 300,000 years old. And so by about 60,000 years ago, humans like us, Homo sapiens, are starting to leave Africa, migrate out, and sort of spread throughout the globe. And so based on mitochondrial DNA analysis, which is really good for charting time because mutations in mitochondrial DNA seem to occur at a fairly steady rate. So you can actually compare how distant different ancestors are based on their mitochondrial DNA. You can actually get a time signature, interestingly enough. But geneticists and anthropologists have been able to sort of plot how long it's taken humans to sort of spread throughout the planet. And so as you can see, we leave Africa maybe 60,000 years ago or so. First stop is kind of the Middle East and sort of Eastern Europe. People sort of spread into the Indian subcontinent and eventually spread throughout Southeast Asia and Northern Asia and into the islands of kind of the South Pacific and Malaysia and Indonesia and Australia. But for a long time, basically no one is in North or South America. And the reason for this is that by the time humans kind of find their way into kind of northeast Russia there, northeast Siberia, by the time they find their way in there, the Earth is in the middle of an ice age. And so until about, let's say about, what's the date on it now? Let's say about 12,000 years ago. Up until about 12,000 years ago, basically all of Canada is covered in ice. Okay, so there's basically a giant glacier that is covering all of Canada in ice about a kilometer thick. And so as people are kind of spreading out through Asia there and into Siberia and up into the northeast part of Siberia, eventually you basically hit a wall of ice. There's really nowhere else to go. And so for the most part, nobody goes anywhere, right? So there's people living in that area of the world. They're hunting, reindeer and mammoths and things like that. Until, as I say, you get to about 12,000 years ago, and the climate starts to warm up. The ice age is over, and that glacier starts to melt. And so what happens is you get kind of a neat in-between period where the glaciers haven't entirely melted, but you can actually cross from Russia into what's now Alaska because it's been so cold, there's so much water trapped in ice that sea levels are actually quite a bit lower than they are now. And so those two land pieces, there's a land bridge, if you will, between Siberia and Alaska. And as the ice is melting, but the sea level is slowly rising, there's a time when people are able to move across, and they do. And so people move across into what's now Alaska, and eventually they find their way into Canada and the US and into Central and South America. And all of those people are the first peoples. And so all of the indigenous people that live in Canada today are descendants of those people who came 12,000 years ago or so. And prior to them, there's basically no humans here. There are no humans here at all. It's just an empty continent with animals and plants and birds and all kinds of things, but no human beings until that time. And so, yeah, they literally were here first. And so often we talk about Canada's First Nations people as like one group of people, right? We kind of put them all in one category, First Nations. But First Nations people are actually very culturally and linguistically diverse. And so even if you look in Canada here, you'll see there's people living in all kinds of different environments, right? So there's people living here on the West Coast where it's kind of warm and wet and it's right by the sea. But then if you go inward, has anyone been to like Kamloops, Kelowna kind of area? You'll see Kamloops. Yeah, you'll see it's a lot more dry, right? It's a lot drier and a lot warmer, a little colder in the winter though, right? Yeah, if you move into the central part of Canada, you'll see that it's also very dry, but also quite a bit colder in the winter, right? And then you move into, there's mountainous areas. If you go north, you'll see that it's basically all ice and snow, and there's people living up there too. And so First Nations people kind of diversify, and they find all kinds of different ways to live in the landscape, and it has to do with kind of where they're living and what resources they have. And so as a result, all these different cultures appear in Canada before white Europeans get here. And so First Nations people aren't one group, they're actually a diverse group of cultures. And so even if you look at, I don't have a map of that. Even if you look at British Columbia, for instance, there's probably a good 10 or 12 languages that are indigenous to this part of the world. So BC, before European contact, had 12 languages that had developed here on their own. And so it's a really diverse place, and that's just around here. Never mind the rest of Canada or the rest of the US or the rest of Central or South America. So we've got all kinds of people that are connected because they're connected to this original migration of people into North and South America, but they're a very diverse group of people. And as I say, lots of different languages, cultures, religious practices, subsistence practices, so the way that they get their food. All of these are kind of different. There's some general similarities because they've all kind of branched out from the same group, but they're also really different and unique. So this is the Canada that we know now and hopefully love, maybe a little bit, right? I'm from right here in Edmonton. Actually, that's not true. I grew up here, but I was actually born in Montreal, which is not on the map, but it's a little south of Quebec.
Montreal?
I was born in Montreal. Yeah. And so my parents moved to Edmonton when I was 4, and I lived there up until about 5 years ago. But anyway, this is the Canada that we kind of know and love, but the story of Canada doesn't start here. It starts further back. And so when Canada became a country in 1867, that's the Canada Day that we celebrate, that's all really that Canada was. It was, it was just a few provinces. It was Ontario, which wasn't as big as it is today. You can see Ontario is quite quite large today. Quebec is quite large today, but at the time it was just a little thing. And then we have New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. And that's all that Canada was as of 1867. But this story, of course, starts earlier than that even. And so we have to go back to, something that looks like this. And so prior to 1867, this is kind of what Canada started out as. And so this eastern part, this red part that is sort of called Canada, is kind of a colonies of British and French people that have come here to trade. There's this Rupert's Land area that the British government gave to the Hudson's Bay Company. And they said, okay, Hudson's Bay Company, you're in charge of this land. You have exclusive rights to operate and trade there, but we're not going to, you're responsible for everything there. So they basically gave them this monopoly over Rupert's Land. And then there's this Northwestern Territory, which was kind of nothing. There was nothing really up there. And then there's kind of a British Columbia thing happening too, right? So there were people who were settling in this area of the world, British and French and other ethnicities as well. But before 1867, you have kind of a very loose, kind of affiliation here. But lots of Canada remains undeveloped, and it remains kind of in the control of First Nations people. Oh, and speaking of which, the Hudson's Bay Company that was given Rupert's Land is the same bay that you see downtown. So if you go to Hudson's Bay downtown, it's the same company. That's the same company. So those blankets that they sell that are kind of, they're white and they have like yellow and green and red and black. Have you seen those? Yeah?
It was originally like trading company, like, right?
Yeah, that's like the original blankets that they made and traded. So they still make a version of that blanket. So you're giving me a look, but yeah, it's the same company from, I think they were incorporated in like 1685 or 17 something. They're a really old company. But again, they were a British company that was given exclusive trading rights to Rupert's Land, and Hudson's Bay is that thing right there. So that's why they're called Hudson's Bay Company, because they worked around Hudson's Bay. There you go. Little Canadian history lesson. So prior to the arrival of Europeans, so of course Columbus discovers the New World in 1492, right? But of course, Indigenous people already lived here and had lived here for thousands of years by the time he showed up. And so we're not sure exactly how many people were here at the time. And so some of the estimates range from about 200 to 500,000 people. Some people suggest as high as 2.5 million Indigenous people were living in Canada, or what would become Canada at the time. And look at that, and between 300 and 450 different languages were being spoken in Canada before Europeans got here. Incredible. But again, we're not sure how many people lived here. Not as many, by today's standards. Now we have 36 million. So they might have had 2 million back then, but still, there were people here, right? So the first missionaries arrived probably in around 1600 or so. We have some Jesuit missionaries arriving on the shores of Canada and the US, attempting to convert Indigenous populations to Catholicism, right? So they saw these people who were without God, without Catholicism, and sought to convert them, and in some cases succeeded. Early on, we also see a lot of trade alliances between First Nations people and Canadians. So that's really why a lot of people come here to begin with, is because they're trading with Indigenous people for furs. Those top hats that you see in all the old-timey movies? The people walking around with their canes and their top hats in the 1800s? Those hats are made of beaver fur. And so, yeah, you take the fur off. You know what a beaver is, right? Our national animal, a rodent with a flat tail. Yeah.
How is the national animal not a moose?
How is it not a moose?
Yeah.
I don't know. The moose is a noble animal as well. I think they chose the beaver because they're very industrious and they like to build, and they're very hardy animals. Have you ever seen them build? Oh my gosh, we don't have time for this today, but yeah, beavers build. First, they build a lodge. Okay, so they take sticks and mud and they build themselves a house in a pond, and the house has underwater access, so the beaver can swim into it and have a nice warm, dry place inside, but nobody can get into it unless you can go underwater. So they have an underwater entrance to their lodge, to their little house. But then what they do is they like to have the water high enough. And so if the water's not high enough in the pond they live in, they'll dam a creek. They'll build a dam to get the water level to rise to where they want it to be. Google beavers after this. They are remarkable. They are remarkable animals. Yeah, they build lodges, they build dams, they can cut down a tree with their teeth. Show me a moose that can do that. Moose. No, I like moose too, but anyway, they're remarkable animals. They construct a lot of things, and so when Canada was kind of building a country, they were like, "Oh, this is a good symbol for us, the noble beaver, even though he's a rodent." You'll see him on the 5 cents, right, on the nickel. There's a little beaver on the back. Yeah. Anyway, right. So that's what people are here for at first. They're trading with indigenous people for furs. And so you take the beaver fur back to England, you get all the fur off the hide, you kind of grind it up and you mix it with some gluey type stuff, and then you flatten it into like a felt. And so that gets shaped into those fancy top hats, and still do those like fedoras that people wear in the 50s movies, you know, when they're like a private detective or whatever. Those are often made of beaver fur as well. So Europeans were coming here trading for these furs, which Europeans really wanted, and indigenous people were getting stuff that they wanted, things like Hudson's Bay blankets, metal axe heads, matches, later on guns and bullets, whiskey later on, which turned out not to be a very good thing to trade for, but that showed up as well. So there was kind of an equal relationship of trade at the beginning. And really, Europeans relied on indigenous people during this period because it was a new place, right? They had no idea what kind of animals were running around here. Apparently there's bears and mountain lions and all sorts of other things. And so indigenous people kind of helped them to get settled and stay safe and learn how to find food on the land, right? So there was kind of an equal partnership at this point, right? And they're trading partners, Europeans coming over to get furs, indigenous people trading those furs for things that they wanted and needed, okay? Yeah, so this was kind of an equal relationship, lots of small-scale agreements between indigenous people and traders and things like that. And so you can kind of see that here, and I just wanted to show you this image. And now it's not really from the time, it's created a little bit later, but to look at it, if you were to analyze this image, what do you see? What do you see in terms of analyzing this image? What message is this image showing us or telling us?
A white man asking something from the indigenous people.
Okay, so we have a bunch of indigenous people here, kind of mostly on the left side of the image, and then on the right side we have some white guy showing up here. What do you think his occupation is?
Give me some food.
Yeah, maybe, but what's he wearing? Like, what's his?
Royal costume.
What's that? He's yeah. He's wearing like a Victorian army uniform. Yeah, so he's a member of the military of some type, right? And so he's coming here, and he looks like he's asking something, right? So he's kind of got his hand outstretched, like, "Hey, I greet you," or "I'd like to ask a favor of you," right? So does he look aggressive in any way? How does he look? He looks very outnumbered. Yeah, so you can see there's a ton of indigenous people standing in front of him, and looks like he's got two of his buddies with him, right? He is super outnumbered. What kind of other impression do you get from him? Yeah, I think I think we could say that he's probably a leader, right?
He's trying to get everyone to listen to him.
Right, and it looks like the people are prepared to listen to him, right? The indigenous people seem to be gathered around this sort of clearing, and so they seem to be listening to what he has to say. I notice his hat's off too. What does that mean? That he's taken his hat off. Kind of, yeah. When you take off your hat, it's kind of a respect thing, right? Nobody wears hats anymore, but in the past, if you went inside, you were supposed to take your hat off, right? Or if a lady walked by, you were supposed to say, "Ma'am," right? You're supposed to take your hat off for a second. So yeah, that's kind of a mark of respect, right? He takes his hat off and greets the indigenous people. How do indigenous people look?
Who is this guy?
Yeah, yeah. What's that?
It's like they're new to them.
Yeah, there's What do you think of their facial expressions?
They frown like this.
Maybe. One guy looks pretty serious there, right? This guy here.
He doesn't care. That guy doesn't care.
Maybe. It looks like he's talking to this person here, right? He's kind of like, what do you make of this? What do you make of these strange pale humans, right? Does anyone look upset?
I think it looks confusing.
Huh?
I think it looks confusing.
Confusing a little bit? Yeah. They look, yeah, they're interested, right? They're kind of like, okay, what's this guy saying? What's that?
So they carry some weapon.
Yeah.
Like some spear.
Yeah, so this guy's got, there's some spears there, and he's got an axe. This guy's got a pipe in his hand for smoking. So they're armed. Yeah, this guy's got kind of an axe there. Do they look like they're afraid?
No. They're outnumbered.
Yeah, they don't seem too worried, right? And these women, look at these women here. Do they seem concerned? No, they seem to be pretty calm and relaxed and talking amongst themselves. So this one kind of shows a little bit of maybe how the relationship would have been at the beginning, right? Because indeed, Europeans were outnumbered, and they had to, you had to be respectful, right? You were entering a land that you didn't know and you didn't understand. These people, we probably don't have time to get into this, these people are experts, right, in their environment. They know everything, right? They know their land like their own house. They know every plant, every animal, every tree. They know how to read the weather. They know how to find food anywhere, anytime. So these people are experts they're in their house, right? And these guys are coming in totally clueless. And so you can see they're being a little cautious. They're taking off their hat. They're saying, we come in peace, sort of thing, right? So you don't really see any evidence at this early point of where this is going to go, unfortunately. And you can kind of see the same message here, right? You see a little bit of a trade going on. So there's a trader or an explorer here and an indigenous person with his bow, and they're trading some furs, right? And so here's a couple other guys, right? There's another trader here. Does he look particularly alarmed or threatened? No, he's sitting there smoking his pipe, right? Here's another indigenous guy, this indigenous guy's friend, and does he look upset or concerned? No, he's just sitting there smoking his pipe too, right? Watching the trade, right? Watching the exchange. Unfortunately, the relationship's not going to stay quite this equal, but it's worth pointing out that it starts that way anyway. One of the things that starts to go wrong very early for indigenous people is disease. And so there's all kinds of diseases that have arisen in Europe, and they're diseases of civilization. Okay, so when you get a lot of people, like thousands and thousands of people, living in one place, like in a city or a village, and that city has really no plumbing or sanitation or water treatment of any kind, which none of these 15th and 16th century cities have. You know, when you have 10,000 people living in the same place, going to the bathroom all the time, you get disease, right? We often kind of take for granted that you can just flush your toilet and all that stuff just disappears. But 400 years ago, it doesn't just disappear. And so it can be kind of a breeding ground for disease. And so all of these things kind of appear from people living in close proximity to each other, and they transmit really easily as well. And so the medieval history of Europe is full of epidemics, right? We've got the plague, right? The Black Death. We've got smallpox and measles and tuberculosis and all of these things that spread their way through Europe and kill all kinds of people, right? Huge numbers of people. But of course, the people that are left behind have a little bit of immunity to it. So they were doing a herd immunity thing before that was actually a thing. So lots of people died, but of course the people left behind were a little more resistant to some of these diseases. However, when those Europeans started coming to North America, the indigenous people had no immunity to those at all, right? Because none of those diseases existed here. And indigenous people tended to live in small groups. They tended to move around a lot. And so prior to 1492, there's no tuberculosis or smallpox or measles or anything in North America. Those things don't exist here. But when Europeans bring them over, indigenous people have no immunity, and there's basically an epidemic, right? And of course, that's kind of what we're going through now with coronavirus. It's a brand new virus. Nobody has any immunity to it, right? We're all susceptible. And that's exactly what happens to the indigenous people. They have no immunity to this. And so massive numbers of their population dies. I may say this a little bit later, but maybe I'll say it now just to make sure that I don't forget. This winds up being a devastating loss for indigenous people, in part because having huge numbers of your community die is traumatic and tragic and awful anyway. But indigenous people don't write anything down for the most part. So these are all societies where they've not developed writing. They don't really need it. Writing usually develops in agricultural societies when they need to keep track of people's tax contributions. Sorry, I know that's not how you want writing to be invented, but that's kind of why it gets invented, to keep track of accounting and paperwork. But indigenous people don't do that here. There's no land ownership, there's no taxes, there's no reason to write anything down. So everything that is known in terms of history, in terms of skills and knowledge, all of that is up here, and it gets passed down through enculturation, right? But if half of your community dies, and a lot of those people are elders, right, because they're usually more susceptible, then where's all that knowledge go? It's gone, right? There's no backup for it, right? Their data is not backed up. And so indigenous people lose huge numbers of their population, but also of their culture and history as well, because it's all kept up here and it's kept with the elders and it's taught through generations. And so when you lose a huge number of people like that, you lose like a chunk of your culture, right? And so at first this isn't anything that the Europeans do on purpose. It's just they happen to bring these diseases with them, and indigenous people have no immunity to them. The other thing that's maybe important in this period to know is this, and it sounds boring, but it's still important to indigenous people today. And it's a royal proclamation by the King of England, who I think is George at the time, King George. And George says, and this is a proclamation to British citizens and British colonists. He says, hey, you guys over in Canada, if you are interested in acquiring land, if you're interested in buying land from the First Nations people there, you may not do that, right? Only the Crown will acquire lands from First Nations people, and then you will buy it from the Crown, right? So the government, the British government, will deal with the indigenous people. They'll buy land or whatever from them, and then if you want land, you'll buy it from us. So the government's saying, we won't respect any deal you make for land with indigenous people. Only the Crown may do that. Only the government may do that, okay? And so this, of course, sounds boring and so what? But for indigenous people, it's important, because what's going to happen is that eventually they're going to lose their land, right? And one of the arguments that's going to be made is that, well, they didn't own it in the first place, right? There was no deed of ownership, so maybe it wasn't theirs. And what this shows is that the British government acknowledges that this land was theirs, right? So the British government is saying, yes, we know the indigenous people have this land. Yes, we know you would like to buy it from them, but we will do it. We will acquire the land from them. So it kind of implies that the government has said that actually this is their land. And so again, it seems a little bit ridiculous to talk about it, but it is important because, again, they're going to lose their land. And here is evidence that the British government admitted that it was theirs to begin with, that it belonged to indigenous people, even if they didn't have paperwork, because they had no paper or writing. Right. So again, massive numbers of indigenous people die probably within, from the 1600s to the mid 1800s. And so things like smallpox and measles, things that we have vaccines for today. Of course, there are no vaccines. These people have no immunity, and people die by the thousands. And huge numbers of, like a huge percentage of people's communities are gone. And as I said, because knowledge is transmitted orally, because they teach it to their children, this is a devastating loss for them, right? So much history and knowledge and culture is lost in this process. But unfortunately, this isn't enough bad stuff to happen, because more bad stuff will happen. And this is where Europeans will start to do things on purpose. One of the things that happens that's quite tragic is the slaughter of the bison. Do you know what a bison is? Bison. It's a this. That's a bison. Or a buffalo. Sometimes people call it a buffalo, but it's not. Apparently a buffalo is a different thing. This is a bison. Sometimes we call them buffalo, though. So this is a bison. They used to live in kind of central Canada, and for the most part, there's a few around still. They're trying to reintroduce them slowly, but back in sort of the 1700s or the 1600s, there were millions of these things. There were herds so large, apparently, that if you were like standing up on a hill, it looked like a brown carpet moving over the landscape. There was so many of them. Huh? I thought you said that's a lot of poo. I was like, yeah, it's probably a lot of poo as well, but it is cool. So there were just millions and millions of these things. And so indigenous people who lived in central Canada would hunt these things for, actually almost everything they needed came from bison. And so indigenous people in central Canada and Alberta, where I'm from, they would hunt these guys and they would use every part of this animal. And so their bones would be used to make tools. They, of course, would eat the meat and the fat and the organs. They would make things out of their horns. Their furs and their skins would be turned into teepees, like that are kind of cone-shaped tents, and their clothing, and all kinds of things. And so the people in the prairies of Canada relied on this animal for just about everything, right? So almost everything you need comes from, it's like the Walmart of, it's like the Walmart of, you know, the indigenous subsistence, right? You can get everything you need from the bison, almost everything. Sorry if that was, I don't know. But that's what makes it even so much more tragic when Europeans start to come and shoot them all. And part of the reason that they get shot is A, the Europeans find it fun, but B, the government has actually put out a bounty on bison, because what the government wants to do is it wants to turn that central part of Canada into farmland, right? It wants to settle European immigrants, it wants to settle farmers in the central part of Canada, and it wants them to set up farms and create a country. But you can't set up farms when there is a brown carpet of giant animals walking around. I actually bumped into one of these. This was the weirdest thing. I was in Edmonton, and there's actually there's a provincial park called Elk Island Park that's east of Edmonton, and they have a population of bison in them. So if you drive out there, I think it's about 45 minutes from Edmonton, you can drive out there and drive around, and often you can see these small herds of bison still there, and they're pretty cool. But I lived at a place, and it was kind of like a strip mall sort of thing, and they had like a butcher shop in there. They had like a meat store. For some reason, they were having some sort of promotion from a farm that provides bison meat, which you can buy because they farm it. And I was walking to work, and I walk around the corner, and there's this thing like standing on the concrete in front of me. They've got it like on a rope, some sort of a rope or something. And there's this bison just standing there, and I sort of jumped back because you don't expect to encounter a bison in a strip mall, but there it was. It wasn't a super big one, but it was like 5.5 feet tall at its shoulder, so it was big enough to surprise me. But they get a little bit bigger than that. They're actually pretty intimidating creatures. And if you ever encounter one, not to be approached. They are not friendly. They do not want to be petted. If you approach them, they will probably stomp on you. So stay well back. They're not friendly. Right. But anyway, so these, throughout the 1800s, these animals are kind of systematically hunted and shot, just so they can be cleared out of the way for farms and settlements. Because again, you can't have these things trampling all over people's crops, right? They'll destroy the farms before anything grows. And so, yeah, you see kind of tragic pictures like this. This is an entire mountain of bison skulls. That's just the skulls.
What did they do?
With
They
the,
used it for
they didn't use them. They just left them. So because the Europeans didn't want them, so they just went out and shot them and made their money and left them there, which of course was tragic and awful to the First Nations people who, A, relied on these animals, and B, you know, it's a waste, right? It's like, so the indigenous people used every part of that animal. Nothing was wasted. They didn't hunt it for fun. They hunted it when they needed food and resources. But here they're just killed to get them out of the way. And so what do you think happens to the indigenous people after all the buffalo are gone? They become angry and they can't survive, right? This is everything, almost everything they need comes from this animal. And if this animal is gone, what do you do, right? And so this is kind of what you do. And maybe this is the last thing I'll say today because there's more to this story, but we won't make it through today. this is what they start to do. They start to petition the Canadian government to make a deal, okay? Because again, Indigenous people are not stupid, right? They can see that throughout the 16 and 17 and 1800s, they can see more and more people coming to their land, settling. Railways are getting built, farms are being created, small cities and towns are cropping up. I mean, Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa, all of these, Quebec City, all of these are cities by this point. Indigenous people see this thing happening and they know that their world is changing, right? And they know that it's not going to go back to what they were used to, and they're going to have to adapt, right? And so here they kind of petition the government and they say, hey, let's talk, let's come to some sort of formal arrangement here, because clearly you're not going anywhere, more and more of your people are coming, our way of life is changing, let's try to sort something out. And so Indigenous people enter into a number of treaties. And so in central Canada, there's 11 of them. And so there's Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3. That's why they're the numbered treaties is what they're called. And so there are agreements between the Canadian government and Indigenous people that sort of structure the relationship between the two, right? And so what do the First Nations people give or allow the government to do, and what can First Nations people expect back from that government in return? And so we'll talk about this a little more on Monday. But long story short, these treaties are not going to go very well for Indigenous people. They're going to negotiate them, but in a lot of cases, the treaties that they sign aren't going to be the treaties that they negotiate, and we'll very quickly see that the government is not very interested in honoring the terms of them either. And so Indigenous people are going to get screwed in the process of this, for lack of a better term. Okay, that is all I'll say for today, because that's a lot. Go and have a really nice weekend and relax a little bit and sleep and go to the gym and eat and then repeat those things. And then, and I'll see you on Monday, okay? All right, see you.